Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. As the title suggests, I'm going to be talking about diversity and inclusion. And it's interesting. I've been working in this area a little bit, talking on it, talking to a lot of people. And a lot of people who've worked in the space have said it's really tough to measure, it's really hard, stay away from it, stick with marketing and performance. But, I like a challenge, and today I'd like to challenge that. So first, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Gabe Goldberg, and my job is to make money for companies through smarter business strategy, through marketing. And I've done so working at really big consumer brands. I've done that working for big media players and also smaller brands, digital startups. And a lot of the lessons are the same. And the lesson that I've taken away is that focusing on inclusion and diversity of the team really matters. There is an idea that a strategy or data is in and of itself objective and separate and apart from the people who examine it, the people who interpret it. And what I continue to learn, no matter where I am, no matter what I'm doing, is that it is always the people who make the brand. And if there's anything that I can do today, it would be to talk to everyone in this room about 3 things that they can do when they walk out of here in order to make positive change. So, connecting with people is tricky, right? Walking into a room, talking to someone you don't know is always hard. You have to figure out what your common ground in is as a marketer or someone who's a communications professional. It is more complicated now than ever. Brands are global. Communication rips through culture. And additionally, expected to talk to people in other countries whose language you don't speak, or people even in your own country who you haven't met before. And you're also, as a marketer, expected to inject your brand into culture. And, it's sort of a contentious environment right now. So how do you do that when you haven't met those people? The less aware you are of who you're talking to, the bigger the minefields. And diversity and inclusion is at a really interesting point, I think, in that a lot of people talk about it in terms of soft measures. Culture, it's good for retention. I've heard a lot. Millennials like inclusion. And I think that those things matter. And as bleeding heart as I may be, I'm also a pragmatist when it comes to business. And I think that if it's not good for business, it shouldn't be done. So I think that that is part of the story, but I think that it's not the whole story. And there can be initiative fatigue. A lot of diversity and inclusion initiatives happen with someone who works in your human resources group or another division, and it's their responsibility to take the organization through this. But the people who I've talked to who work in these functions have said, big secret, people like it and they kind of believe in it, but we don't actually know how to measure it, and we're not really sure what those outcomes look like, but we do believe that it's important, so we keep doing it. I even had someone at a global hotel company say to me, honestly, I wouldn't even get into this if I were you. This ends up being a job where I push a lot of paper, but it's not material to the outcome of the business. It always falls by the wayside, and it's a secondary objective. And I'm going to do 2 things, actually, that I don't like in presentations. I'm going to talk about Apple, and I'm going to apologize for talking about Apple, because I think that they're way too overused. But what happened recently is too relevant to the topic, so I'm going to break my own rule. The Apple board had an option. They knew that there's mounting evidence that diversity in senior leadership helps improve the outcome, and the board was actually given the choice to include diversity and inclusion initiatives in their hiring process. And they actually decided they weren't going to do that. And instead, they were relying on, like many companies do, on a VP of Inclusion and Diversity, Denise Young. She's been doing this for a while. Recently, actually about a month ago, she was at a conference in Bogota, Colombia, and she said this: there can be 12 white, blue-eyed, blonde men in a room, and they're going to see diverse too because they're going to bring a different life experience and life perspective to the conversation. So, unsurprisingly, Twitter erupted, as it always does every time there's a controversy. And this right or wrong, good or bad, is narrow. it feels a little bit more like a company who's in defensive mode, rationalizing decisions that they're not making so they can go on as business as usual. But instead of just talking about the bad, I also want to talk about the good. McKinsey recently published a study, and they looked at 366 companies in the US, UK, Canada, and Latin America. And they actually found, I thought, some pretty interesting data. So they looked at senior management diversity, and they looked at ethnic background, and they also looked at gender. For companies that over-indexed in diversity, had more inclusive environments for senior management and above, they were 35% more profitable than companies that didn't. And when only gender diversity was taken into consideration, they were 15% more profitable. And in the US, and actually in the UK, there was a very straight line. So if you looked at that senior management team, for every 10% increase in the amount of diversity that existed on those teams, there's a 0.8% increase in earnings. In the UK, it was actually more dramatic. For every 10% more diversity that was included in the management team, there's actually 3.5% more earnings. And nowhere is the strategy of a business or a company more obvious than in its external communication, whether that is a product launch or whether that is a piece of advertising. That always comes to life, and it can become really clear to see how you got from point A to point B. So for everything that looks like this,
come on, put your hands together.
you have different body types, you have different cultural backgrounds. It's a really an inclusive ad, if you will, aimed at getting a large number of people in a gym, so you're not only looking at people who are absurdly fit with an unrealistic body type, right? Great way to stand out. So for every one of those, or even one of these.
When were you first considered a family? When you fell in love? When you got married? When you had kids? When did you first fight to be considered a family? When you fell in love? When you got married? When you had kids? Family isn't defined by who you love, but how. Tylenol.
That's their job, right? These are mass brands expected to reach and encourage the most amount of people to fall in love with them, and that's exactly what they do. And how do I know that there was a diverse group of people making this? Because actually Tylenol won an ANA Multicultural Award, and many of the people who were responsible for the creation of the strategy and this work were on stage. And actually, a little inside baseball, I was one of the people who helped contribute to the development of the strategy, and I have the advantage of seeing what happened to the interpretation of the data when the team was a little bit more homogenous, and then actually quite organically what happened to the interpretation of the data the more people from different backgrounds joined. So for every one of those, you actually get things like this, right? You see Kendall Jenner solving racism and world peace because she got to give a Pepsi to a cop to stop the protest, and then, you know, there's, of course, ensuing backlash, and she gets a great media opportunity, and she does well. Pepsi doesn't do well. I don't know if anyone saw this, but there's an enormous amount of backlash, and the team who did this was actually an internal agency at Pepsi, very insulated by whatever that culture was, and you can see how, you know, there's a tone deafness around the ad. I'm not going to play it because a lot of people have seen it already. But there's that, or you get things like this. Snapchat last year was celebrating 420, and they released a Bob Marley's filter. And that had the unintended consequence of a bunch of white people putting his filter on, and then, of course, outrage and frustration that Snapchat was promoting blackface. And look, this was a licensing deal. So Bob Marley's family was a part of this, and it's understandable how it would have happened. But 3 months later, they actually made the same mistake again and launched a yellow face ad and then had to come out again and say that they were sorry and it was never their intention to dissuade people. But you see what's happening. A company who actually relies on people coming to their platform and use it is actually doing the very thing that they're trying not to do. Trying to bring people to you, this is actually pushing them away. And Evan Spiegel, the CEO, came out and he said that, he thinks diversity is really important, but he's not going to quantify it. And they're actually one of the technology companies that refuses to release any data on who the makeup of their staff is. And since then, their user base continues to decline. That has a lot to do with Instagram and how they're reaching people. But you can see how you can get into a problem if you're going to try and reach people that you want to love you. You need to surround yourself with those people. But sometimes you even get things like this. The Daily Beast, this was during the Rio Olympics, had 2 writers who made the choice to uniquely cover the Olympics, and their angle was, let's talk about dating, but actually let's talk about it from a gay perspective. And so one of the straight writers went on Grindr, got some dates, and then published an article. And while he didn't mention any names, what he did do was talk about their height, the weight, the games they participated in, and their country of origin, which, if you don't know better, could seem like a really fun way to learn about an app and how people are dating. But the problem was that the unintended consequence was he outed athletes who are in countries where being gay was actually illegal and punishable by death. So there's absolutely no way that, I'm going to be an optimist. I don't believe that there's any way that that was his intention. I think it was an idea gone wrong. And what was revealed also is that he and his editor both had very similar profiles: straight white men, wives, kids, limited background. And they talked about how they needed to do better, but also never released. It's been over a year now, have still never released any plans. The writer, who is actually a lauded journalist, and I think anyone would be lucky to work with them, was put on suspension. And it's not always good or bad. Sometimes brands can recognize the error of their ways. Take Airbnb, for example. Now, they've had a few problems with racial bias on their platform. It's intended to be a very democratic platform, but they also were sourcing from a limited pool of people in order to develop their strategy. And actually, they've been very open about that. So you have a TV producer who was actually denied rental after she revealed that she was transgender. A year ago, black man decided that he wanted to rent on Airbnb. He was initially accepted on a July 4th holiday, and later came back and was told that the house wasn't available because the owners were staying in town. And he said, no problem at all, I love your house, I'd love to come on Memorial Day. And they said, actually, we're going to be in town then too, so it won't work. And he got suspicious, so then he signed up with a dummy account. He kept all his vital stats the same, but he did change his name and he did change his picture, reapplied for July 4th, and was accepted as a white man. And it wasn't a unique experience. The Harvard Business Review actually did a study on this, and they found that potential renters with black names, black faces, black identities were 16% less likely to be approved. And Airbnb had a big problem on their hands. Their job is to get as many people on this as possible, and they did all the things that a brand should do. Publicly came out and talked about it. They invited Eric Holder to be on their board. They started partnerships with the NAACP and the Congressional Black Caucus, and said that they were going to release new terms of service, which they did. And those terms actually talk about how they don't want any racial profiling, and if you do that, you can be kicked off their platform. And even since, when they've had incidents like that, people who were renting their houses and they were profiling, they actually said that in order to stay on, they needed to go to diversity and inclusion classes to become more sensitive to the topic. So all great things, right? And during the Super Bowl, this is also how they recovered, to sort of let people know that they were changing the game on themselves. So in addition to the senior levels of the organization, they also said that they recognized that the real problem came from bias that they didn't even realize they had. Because what they were doing from a recruitment perspective was going out to colleges where existing employees worked, right? That's the easiest way to source talent. And what they didn't realize is that they were just pulling people who looked exactly like the people who were already in the organization because it was the best and easiest way to recruit. So they actually said that they were going to change their entire process, and they were committing to, instead of a 7% worker population that was black, increasing that to 9 by the end of 2017. And additionally, in order to do that, they were going to go to historically black colleges and start those recruiting efforts where they actually didn't have relationships to diversify their talent and try and prevent things that had just happened. But these are really big players with really big budgets and a lot of opportunity. And not everyone here has got the opportunity to do that. Sometimes you want to make change a little bit faster. So what if you can't actually afford to have one of those fails? What if one of those fails would mean the end of your job, the end of your product, the end of your service? What if you don't have a huge inclusion budget? Google spends $150 million on inclusion alone. That's an enormous amount. I wouldn't know what to do with a $150 million inclusion budget. What if I actually really like my coworkers and they're valuable contributors? I mean, I like the people that I work with. I don't want to go home and go back to work and get rid of them only to hire other people. They're smart. What if I don't get waves of new recruits every year or every quarter or every month, like Amazon, like Google, like Apple? What if I don't have a perfect cultural measurement tool? And what if my management team hasn't bought into this? And what if there's no inclusion program and I don't know much about it? And what if I just want my corner of the world to be a little bit more productive and a little bit more effective? What can you really affect? I have a very unlikely case study that I'm really excited to talk to you about. Because sometimes when you don't have those other things, your only opportunity is to just look at everything from a slightly different perspective. These were the circumstances. There's no new business data, no new training, no meaningful turnover, no initiatives, no new leadership team, no additional budget, no new CEO, and the same digital communication, data, and access. Literally nothing changed. Well, 13 years ago, for this business that launched in Bellevue, the management team looked very similar to the environment in which it was launched. Fairly white, and Bellevue actually looked like that about 13 years ago. In fact, the 2010 census said that Bellevue at the time was 75% white, 17% Asian, the balance Latino, African American. And that made a lot of sense for a tanning salon, right? A lot of white people. It's a very specific need. A lot of people were interested in it, and the company boomed, actually for a really long time, still doing well today. But fast forward to a year ago, and not a lot had changed. And not a lot had changed because the environment was good. People liked working there, even if people hadn't been there from the very beginning. They had been there for a really healthy amount of time. And there were opportunities to learn, there were opportunities to grow, there were opportunities to do new things, and there are far greater sins for a business than having a nice environment for people to work in, right? They did realize that business was plateauing and they weren't getting as many new people through the door, there weren't as many unique people coming in, even though there'd been expansion of services. So the challenge became, how do we grow? And knowing that there were no budgets, the only resource they had at their disposal was their people. So you take the same empowered environment that had already existed, you take people from different backgrounds, different parts of the business, right, beyond just the team that existed, and add 10 months. And let's see what can happen. The people that they decided to work with had different backgrounds. There were people from different levels of the company, people at retail that didn't necessarily fit the profile, if you will, of the historical client. So this is Filipino background, Japanese background, Mexican background, Italian. These are people who had worked there. And add them to the people who are, from the United States and just pull them together and start looking at all of the data. And great thing about people is that we're pack animals. We like to do things together. We like to do things in herds. But when you expand your definition of the pack, then the pack you support ends up expanding. And there were 3 key things that they learned only from changing the people who are at the table. I'm excited to talk to you about these. So first, who's the customer going to be tomorrow? Nothing actually changed, but all these people started looking at the environment, and King County is actually diversifying faster than the rest of the country. So the areas in dark purple are places that are 75% or greater have people of color. You'll see the dark green goes up to 50%. That's really huge change. That's just 13 years. And then if you also look at the other slide on the right, that shows the percentage of breakdown of immigrant enrollees in the Seattle Public Schools. Of the people who are immigrants who move, only 11% are white. 30% are black, Asian is almost 41%, and Hispanic is about 16%. So that's a shifting consumer base right under the feet of a very business that is primarily used to serving white people who want a tan. And if you think that this is only relevant for a tanning salon, I think we only need to look to a week ago to realize that this can happen anywhere. AOL Instant Messenger just closed its doors because the very people that it was intended to serve vanished. They went to other platforms. They stopped innovating. The second, and this I think is really important, you have to ask questions that you do not want to hear the answer to. And this exists at every single company, exists for every single product, every single service. Do people like us? Are we filling a need? And are we going to fill a need tomorrow? And you cannot grow if you don't learn. And you cannot learn if you're not then willing to take action based on that knowledge, because otherwise it's a philosophical pursuit, and that's not the point of a business. And the reality is that there are stigmas that come with the service, with tanning, right? Everyone searched online, they know. And this is not a judgment call. I mean, I'm a marketer. I'm the last person who can sit here and pass judgment. And, you know, alcohol is a product that's sold. Vegas has its own attachments to sin. You can't even market Coke without being accused of promoting childhood diabetes. So everything comes with something, right? But the reality is you have a shrinking consumer base, a shrinking need, and a service that's not probably set up to grow. And the third thing that they learned is beware of culture fit. Culture fit is one of those keywords that's used in hiring and retention and even promoting people that can become really coded, because it can mean they don't look like me, they don't have the same background as me, they're not the same gender, they don't have the education that I do, wherever that's defined. And there were a million reasons why all the people that were talked to from all those different backgrounds could have been X'd out because they weren't the right culture fit. They don't have an MBA, they didn't have a background in marketing, how are they going to interpret data? What are they really bringing to the table in terms of operations? This isn't their role. But the company prioritized inclusion over historical background just to bring different perspectives to the table. And 10 months ago, the killer insight that this team came up with, when people look better, they feel better. And that's a little bit of a joke, because that's the exact same insight that launched the tanning salon chain 13 years earlier. Now there's 35 stores. There's not growing a lot. And actually they learned the same thing that they knew all the time, but the difference was there had been a ton of new services added. Now, I don't know if anyone here knows about light therapy. I can tell you when I learned about it, it was all very new to me. But technology and innovation, as technology and innovation do, had changed rapidly since 13 or 12 years prior. And they had been including new services that not only weren't tanning related, they were also cleared by the FDA. Physicians had looked at it, determined they were safe. There were really valid clinical improvements for a variety of things, like, for example, if you're blotchy, have rosacea or uneven skin tone. You can go in and get what's called red light therapy that doesn't have any UV rays, and just to help clear your skin. This also stimulates collagen and elastin production so you can fill in wrinkles without needles or knives. Or if you're a mom and you want your kids to clear up their acne, but you don't really want to put them on something as harsh as Accutane, they also had a piece of technology called blue light therapy, which does the same thing for your skin. Or there's even infrared, which even though you can't see it, is also a form of light therapy. It can do things like reduce chronic pain for up to years after you go through treatments. And all of this is clinically validated, safe, and all that good stuff. But the problem is that it was just being sold as more. So the people who were coming in were just being upsold products, and as you can imagine, there's obviously a barrier that comes with tan because it's, as we know, hitting a very narrow customer base. And just by including people with all of these different backgrounds at the table, what they realized is that the people at the table started to look more like the people who were actually already coming in, right? They're getting drips and drabs, but there was a real opportunity that wasn't being seized. And when you look at how the cultural landscape of King County and really specifically Bellevue changed, they weren't necessarily set up for the future. So digging into the data, they found that the strongest areas of growth were actually all of those services that we talked about. And something else interesting started to happen as I started to talk to people who were working at the retail level. Chinese men and women were actually coming into different stores asking if they could get skin lightening services, which is a little bit of a weird conversation considering it's a tanning salon. It's going in the other direction. Indian clients were calling. Actually, we heard this a few times. Doctors were even recommending that their customers who had redness might want to call a tanning salon because sometimes they have red light therapy machines and they could go in there and safely get rid of redness. The moms who were going in there for services had kids who wanted to reduce their acne. And even some of the women who were customers and wanted to stay customers were also interested in other things. Like, for example, they wanted to reduce inches or spot lose weight. And there was also LED body contouring, which doesn't rely on, expensive or dangerous solutions like liposuction would absolutely work, but there also is a bit of risk with those. When they looked outside, what they also saw was that many of the services that they already had were growing very rapidly. So tanning, actually, they were doing a very good job of holding all of the people that they had, and even in a market that was in decline, they were beating the market. Where they weren't growing was all of these new things when it's actually already proved that there's demand. So there wasn't a business problem. They knew exactly how to get people and how to bring them in, but there was another obstacle. Their name was the barrier. The very brand that was inserting all of these new products and services was preventing all of these new people from coming in at the same rate that they were actually entering the entire market. So they decided to lean in to the thing that they had been known for since the very beginning.
All of the lights.
Who doesn't love a little old school Kanye? So Seattle Suntan pivoted. They expanded what they stood for while still keeping many of the services and adding many new services, because all of a sudden they didn't stand for tanning. They actually stood for safe light therapy through skin and body, and realized that in order to set themselves up for the future, or as the CEO said, what he had to figure out what he wanted to be when he grew up, and maybe it's fitting that on the 13th birthday, bar mitzvah joke, the name changed. And actually 24 hours ago, they reopened their Bellevue store on Main Street as the Seattle Sun Light Spa. And there's a variety of new services that reach a variety of new clients, and many of them were coming in already. This was just about expanding what they stand for. And these are not people who you would normally think of to be the existing customer, but this is exactly who they need to reach in order to grow. And that's more people through the door, that's more backgrounds through the door, and that is more ways to serve those customers. That's good for everybody because diversity is often, as we know, looked at as a really soft measure or a nice to have or just a way to keep people happy and engage people and retain them. But this is not box ticking, and this is not just meetings, and this is not a nice to have. This is really your business, and this is an incredibly important way to look at business problems and solve it, because like we talked about in the beginning, strategy is not disconnected from the people who make it. The people make the brand does not make the people. So if you don't have a big budget, if you don't have an executive who's championing it, you don't have a program, of course there are tools that you can learn in order to bring things back, but you don't need all of those things, because if you want to win with inclusion and you want to create stronger, better, faster, higher performing teams, my bet is that you already have exactly what you need inside your company. Thank you very much.